Hey guys, what's going on? Snoo here. Welcome to a crafting video. This is all things elemental hit of the Spectrum Warden crafting. Okay, so every single piece of gear that's involved in the path of building for this guide, early in-game stuff, crit inspired learning, headhunter variant, the Nimbus ring with the Tailwind Onslaught boots, all of that. You can see I am at the very end of this build's journey. I have only a Progenesis left to farm as far as major gear upgrades, and then the build will be done. I will be transitioning to a tornado shot variant, which we're not going to talk about at all here, but you can check the history of my channel in 3.25 to see what that looks like at the very end. A super high performing version, and highly recommend you guys transition to that if you're interested. But assuming that you're just wanting to know about elemental hood of the spectrum, this is going to be a great place for you to see how you might craft some of these pieces of gear. You might just go on trade and see if they already exist, of course, but I will tell you I did craft most of these. I'll go over a little bit of story on each individual item. You can use the timestamps down below if you're searching for a specific one, but we're going to be looking at the easy stuff first. All right, so let me take you real quick into path building just to overview. This is the path of building. This will be linked in the description. This is straight from the guide. There are loadouts here, and if we take these loadouts and we go straight to the items, you'll see not very many rare items to worry about crafting. We have early endgame, then we have crit double inspired learning with a new bow, and then we have crit headhunter variant, and then we got the late endgame, really late endgame with Nimbus ring and the other boots. Kind of just tacking on one additional rare item each time. As a sort of honorable mention, let's go ahead and talk about the cheapest versions first. I'm not really going to make a big deal out of them. Yeah, this is just basically any sort of fracture, half-decent fracture, tier 3, tier 4 fracture, grove bow. Not caring about crit, not necessarily trying to attack speed. Maybe bow attacks, fire additional arrows, a luxury roll, not super important, especially not for single target. But yeah, you're just trying to hit the fire and lightning, which is actually pretty easy in this case because you just use the fossil crafting to do this. Okay, you only need to use a scorched fossil, metallic fossil, and then a double resonator, 2-slot resonator. And those resonators are a little more expensive now, but they were really cheap at League Start. And then this will hit fire and lightning virtually every single time because of the changes that took place before. Essentially use the same concept to get a crit bow, which isn't really represented in the path of building, but if you can just imagine this bow right here without 2 additional arrows and with, let's say, the fire roll fractured, which is kind of what I was dealing with before, I essentially jumped the gun. All right, so because I was making so much currency with the mercenaries, and the inventories and all that stuff, I actually skipped the grove bow and just went for essentially the grove bow in crit form with a spine bow. And then I also wanted to fossil craft it so it had, a crit or attack speed roll, and then bench craft the one it was missing. It wasn't that much harder to hit. And then you guys saw it, and you can look back at some of my VODs to see the path of building that I was using, or the previous YouTube videos. Like when I was farming tier 17 bosses, you can see what the bow I had there. I had a pretty good one. Honestly, wasn't that hard to hit. I got a little lucky on hitting. I ended up hitting 2 in like a grand total of 3 slams, which is pretty insane. But I don't expect you have to spend much more than 1 or 2 divines in fossil crafts to hit something that is kind of like all tier 3 and above, somewhere in there. As for the belt, this was pretty simple. It requires an intelligence fossil though, or not fossil, rather essence. Okay, so you can't actually roll intelligence on belts except through an essence. So this is a small point of confusion, but other than that, it's pretty simple. Just try and hit life, and then any resistance, you can change the resistances at the harvest crafting bench. It just keeps the same tier. It's pretty cheap. So if I had hit fire res, fine, I can change over to lightning res, etc. I used the chaos fracture because it was a decent place to put that in there, and tried to bench craft elemental damage with attacks if possible. It's pretty easy craft. You didn't necessarily have to do this, but this hits the marks, and you're missing chaos res, you're missing intelligence, getting some life, getting a little bit of extra damage. You used prism weave before this. It was kind of fine. You can always buy a Stygian Vice or something, but that's not going to come fractured, so it'll be harder, and you're going to be missing the intelligence. You have to down level your elemental weakness and flame dash, which isn't the end of the world. So there's, there's like, I guess 10 different ways to go about it, but that's basically it. And I end up using, it's just a shrieking essence. It's not that bad. Okay, next up, this is the bow that I'm using. You can see it has this spine bow with the 2 additional arrows. We're going to talk about that one in a little more detail in game. The same belt holds over. This is the crit double inspired learning setup, and it still features no cluster jewels, so nothing else to craft there. If we move forward, we can see the crit headhunter variant. It adds in the gloves, okay? Still using the, oh yeah, it also adds a quiver too, so those kind of come in at the same time. Removing the gloves means you're losing Pain Seeker, which means you're losing a lot of freeze potential and really high scorches. You start to make up for it in sheer damage though, and so that works out really nice. These gloves are, of course, much more typical of actual in-game gloves, and then the Quiver too. So kind of moving away from the specialized early in-game cheaper uniques that we're using to build for some more true in-game rares. And then the boots are added at the final version with Nimbus, okay, and then you lose some links there, so that has some different meanings for the build, which we'll talk about in a second here. But anyway, it's just kind of an overview, not many items, and so that's by design. I don't like crafting too terribly much, but these are some pretty high tier crafts, and so we're going to go over them now. Okay, we're back in the game here, and we're going to go over these different crafts. We got the 4 big ones here. We got the bow, gloves, boots, and quiver, okay? And in somewhat in particular order, but also we have some cluster jewels that are in play here. I honestly just recommend buying this 8 passive bow cluster because it's actually a flexible slot, all right? It can be really any 3 variations. It doesn't necessarily have to be any one of these particular ones, but kind of important to have 3 good ones. If you get Feed the Fury, you can remove the necessity for life leech down here. It helps get the crit with arcing shot. Martial prowess is the best suffix. Over here, this would be like a reforged caster, I believe, to hit this medium cluster. Not very hard on that. Now, this one is a totally different animal, guys. This one's actually basically impossible to hit without fracturing. Corrosive Elements doesn't have a tag tied to it, and extraordinarily low weighting. Has to be on cold or lightning in order to get Storm Rider, and then you kind of reforge lightning if it's on a cold cluster, or reforge cold if it's on a lightning cluster. Cold cluster is going to be better, I think. And so yeah, you have to start with the fractured. Widespread destruction, not necessary, just any of the 3. Least important craft of them all, but this does help with the loss of exposure because of the loss of Hydrosphere, because of the loss of Lionized Paws when putting in these boots, and also removes the need to get Power Charge on crit, which means I can get like Innervate and Bone Chill as opposed to maybe just Power Charge on crit and Bone Chill. So a nice little side point there. Pretty cool cluster, but very high expense for the amount of value you get out of it. Don't necessarily recommend this cluster for everybody. Okay, now the rest of the time we're going to be talking about the most important items. So the bow is something you obviously would like to get pretty soon. This is about a 50 to 100 divine bow. As a base, I had to pay, I think, 27 divines for it pre-fractured. You could fracture it yourself. Actually, I think it's a profit fracture. It does have the enchant harvest enchant on there. And there's no fracture for the flat elemental damage, so there's no fossil business here. We got to go back to the original way to craft these bows, which is a tier 0 essence. Fire in this case was anger. This is the only essence involved. And the way this works is you're basically just trying to hit tier 1 of another flat with an open prefix. And then when you get that open prefix, you're going to go over here. Let's say I got an open prefix with flat lightning, tier 1 flat lightning. Okay, then I have reforged cold, right? And that's going to fill it in, guaranteed now. Okay, can't hit a resist mod. It's going to be guaranteed to hit flat cold. Now, will it hit a good tier flat cold? Probably not. So this is where you can see the expense of the bow starts climbing pretty rapidly. Now, you might get super lucky and just essence it straight into this spot. So after I failed that a few times, I actually just essenced these numbers straight up. I hit the tier 1 cold and tier 3 lightning together. Very lucky. Okay, and the suffixes were fine. They were junk, and then I had to, you know, clean them off by going over here. Okay, prefixes cannot be changed. It's 2 divines each time. And yeah, you got to use prefixes cannot be changed before you reforge cold. I forgot to mention that on the last one. So you got to always use this to protect the prefixes that you have, whether you're in the process of filling out the 3rd prefix or you're done with the prefixes. Okay, and now moving to the suffixes, then it's reforge attack. Not attack, sorry, reforge speed. Reforge speed right here, okay? And so that is going to be pretty costly because it's not very likely to hit tier 1. So I was going to settle for tier 1 or tier 2. And honestly, for most people, I would recommend a Veiled Chaos Orb. If you want to see what that looks like, it's actually pretty cheap. Veiled Chaos Orb, my goodness, is only like 4 or 5 chaos right now. And this does what it used to always do. Okay, not to be confused with Veiled Exalted Orb over here, which is actually very expensive. Veiled Chaos Orb will work here, and then you can just get one of the crit, chance, or attack speed variants. I don't really like Blood Rage, though, I will say. Not for this build, because then you got to deal with a live degen, but I mean, it's okay. This is the higher version of doing it, trying to get the high tier attack speed rolls, so this definitely elevates a bow, and it's probably worth at least 100 divines at this point. But I only spent about 50 divines, so I got relatively lucky on this. And I bench crafted the strength and intelligence, which is nice because I really do need the intelligence roll. Let's go Quiver next. Okay, this is a traditional craft that is has existed in the community for a long time. The way to craft quivers, elemental quivers, has not changed. Since I started playing the game years ago. All right, so once again, we have a bow attacks, fire, additional arrow, fractured. All right, pre-fractured either on attack speed, prefix, or implicit, or, well, attack speed or projectile speed base quiver. All right, I like attack speed better. And then I used this essence. All right, so I think cold is probably the best. Okay, this is flat cold, very cheap essence. And this is either going to go one of two ways, all right? In both ways, I'm going for a high tier 1, tier 2 crit multi. I'm basically going for tier 1 and tier 2 on all of this, okay? Tier 3 maybe I settle for if the rest of it's really good, like this. But yeah, tier 1 or tier 2 crit multi. And then it needs to have an open suffix, which you may need to annul. It also needs to have 1 or 2 open prefixes. Either 2 open prefixes or 1 open prefix with another high tier flat roll, which is actually better because then you only need to worry about hitting max life. The high tier flat roll, flat fire, or flat lightning in addition to cold is about on par with a high tier increased damage with bow skills for this build as it stands. So that's not a bad route to go. It makes it a lot easier to finish the craft. You're front loading the challenge of the craft and you're just going to have to essence more if you do that. That is what I was going to go, but I initially hit the max life roll with an open prefix, so I figured, okay, to hell with it. We'll at least go for it, right? And what does going for it mean? It means cannot roll attack modifiers. 1 divine each time. Okay, that's a suffix, so you had to have the empty suffixes to hit that. And then you basically exalt annulling your butt off to try and hit high tier max life. Either just max life or max life plus bow skills damage, which is pretty hard to hit that double combo, okay? Tier 2, tier 3 is pretty lucky. And you can't actually hit tier 1 on an item level at 78 base. So you have a reprieve on a lower base if you settle for not getting tier 1. If you're going for tier 1 on all, then I don't think it's actually worth doing that because then you have to pay a lot more for the base. And yeah, anyway. So what happens when you're constantly annulling, you might rip off this bench mod here and you have to keep putting it back on there. And what always happens is you end up, getting a high tier life roll and then you annul it straight off. And then you get a high tier percent roll and then you null it off. And trying to get them both at the same time is pretty hard. So I actually recommend getting double flat. That way you only have to hit max life. At the very end, you're bench crafting either attack speed or frenzy if you need frenzy, which you actually do temporarily, I think, at one point when you get your auras figured out, like with enlightened support and stuff, you drop frenzy on this Mana Forge link. You put Flame Dash back in here instead. And so that way you can do that because you can gain Frenzy Charge on Critical Strike. But if you have Frenzy plugged in here, which means you got the boots, then that changes again. You got attack speed and bench craft, so small thing. Okay, next let's do the gloves, guys. Let's do the gloves. So we got a very interesting pair of gloves. It looks a little different than the ones I did. The ones I was advertising was easier and I think more suitable for most players, especially if you're just going for the endgame version of this and you're not planning to move up to Tornado Shot. This is where I kind of have to mention Tornado Shot as an endgame variant that I'm going for, and my gloves and boots I spent a little extra on getting them really, really nicely rolled because I know that they're essentially finished pieces or practically finished pieces going into a Tornado Shot transition. What I mean is I went for the Temple mod here. Increased damage with hits against killed enemies. This is by far the hardest thing to do with the bowcraft is to get that fractured. It can't possibly drop in the ground fractured, I don't think. Not with that, so you end up having to fracture it manually. Just so you know, you can purchase the light or fire variations and switch them over with the harvest bench. That looks like this, okay? So even if you get the wrong temple mod, you can actually switch them. A lot of people didn't know that. And I ended up buying a fire temple mod and switched it over to cold and kept doing it over and over and over again until I hit it right. So you effectively divine it for, not for free, but for very cheap doing that. Okay, I hit the fracture, got lucky, I hit it in one try. And I decided to use, not this essence actually. Decided to use, let's see, what's it called? Zeal, yeah, Zeal, okay. Deafening Essence of Zeal is actually a tier 0, even better than tier 1 attack speed. And either you can do this or Intelligence for Spite. Now, it depends on what you're looking at here. I'm having to use 2 of these to get 60 Intelligence. So that clocks in at around the value of 9% attack speed each. You know, just doing a little bit of soft math. 9% attack speed per passive skill, which is borderline worth it. But again, I know that I'm going to want it set up this way for Tornado Shot, so I went this way. You do not need to get the Temple mod on here. If you want to make it easier, Intelligence with the Essence, and you'll only have to 2 of them. Because you're probably going to fracture life in that case. You're going to get gloves with fractured life or gloves with a fractured resist would be fine. Fractured Life is probably better because then you can prioritize a 5th affix as a 2nd prefix more easily through Eldritch Crafting. Okay, this is the only piece of gear that involves Eldritch Crafting. These are items that, or currency that you can use to exclusively craft on the prefix side after you're done. And then there's also the issue of trying to get the implicits here. Now, these implicits, to get 2 additional rage on attack, you're going to need it to be almost perfect, one notch away. So to do that, you use Grand Eldritch Embers until you get rage, and then you use 1 Grand Eldritch Ichor, and then you use Orb of Conflict to make, you know, 1 go up, 1 go down. And then if you get the correct one to go up, you use another Grand Eldritch Ichor because it weights in favor of the one that's lower. So you're going to try to keep them as close as you can. And it's usually a pain in the butt, and this is where I always end up losing a lot of currency. And like usual, I failed to get that exquisite implicit for a very long time and spend a lot more of extra currency. I would wager these gloves, if you're going for the fracture this way, they're like in the 40 to 80 divine range. But without that, they're probably in like the 20 to 40 div range at the most, okay? By the way, the Quiver is probably also around the 20 to 40 div range. So we got a bow at like 50 to 100, a Quiver at 20 to 40, gloves at, my gloves put around 30 to 60, 40 to 80, somewhere in there. And then the boots. All right, so the boots are the last one that we're working on. Now, these boots, I actually just bought them off trade. I'll be honest with you, I just bought them off trade because I knew exactly what I wanted on the mods, and I didn't want to deal with trying to make them myself, profit crafting the ones that failed to hit, and then just dealing with that. I just bought them. I bought them straight up for 100 div, and then I divined them for like 25 times or something to hit this. Actually, the suffixes were already pre-divined, so I got very unlucky on the divines, just trying to hit the perfect movement speed rolls. But anyway, they're done now, and I will never have to worry about these again. I probably never have to mess with it, even once I get multi-mirror tier gear. And the reason I did that is because I really wanted the tier 1 elemental res roll to match up with the 2 elemental res rolls here, and then, you know, using double taming when I switch to tornado shot, that's going to work really nicely. But you don't need to do that because you have a Nimbus ring, right? And you're using Purity of Elements. I won't be using Purity of Elements with tornado shot, but I'm using Purity of Elements now, so the resists are fine. I can get that little bit of extra lightning res on the clusters. And so if you're just isolating the craft for this specific build, you don't need to care about the suffix. The 3rd suffix, the hardest thing to hit on this craft. And you don't necessarily need to have this specific chosen movement speed mod. It is the best one, though. To do this craft, you basically, you just purchase a Hunter Tailwind pair of boots, random boots, and then you get Fugitive boots, Redeemer Slam them, and I actually can't, hold on, I can't even remember how the best way to get, I guess Reforge Caster. Yeah, probably Reforge Caster to get the Onslaught mod on there, and then, whoops, forgot the one thing. All right, Orb of Dominance, okay. Now, Orb of Dominance means, you know, you have to have at least 2 influence mods, Hunter and then Redeemer, and then you got to elevate them, okay, if you're trying to make it yourself. It's honestly a pain in the butt. I recommend just leaving other people to craft these if I were you. I feel like this craft is fairly reasonable in terms of prices. There's a lot of people who try to craft them. The market's pretty tight on it, and I don't see a huge advantage to going through all this headache process yourself. But again, you know, you can elevate both sides and then slam them together with an Awakener's Orb, and then just deal with whatever 3rd suffix you get. Then you reforge crit, okay? Reforge crit, well, you do prefixes or suffix. Actually, in this case, suffixes cannot be changed. Reforge crit, this is guaranteed to hit elusive on crit. Not going to worry about elevating that. And then you do, once again, suffixes cannot be changed. And it's a 50-50 Veiled Exalted Orb Slam. This is 7 divines now, okay, on a 50-50. And even then, you're not 100% guaranteed at movement speed, and you're definitely not guaranteed at the best movement speed roll. But if you do, then that's it. And then you got to divine it, and then you benchcraft maximum life. So it's a bit of a process, these boots. Again, very old craft that's existed a long time. A lot of people are aware of it, and for most of you, I would just recommend just leaving it to the experts who can craft these boots and just probably purchasing them outright. There's several pairs that are decent already on trade for like 40 to 50 div. So it's honestly not that bad. For the expense and the headache it takes to craft these, yeah. The bow, quiver, and gloves you can definitely do yourself. And the quiver and the gloves you probably will need to do yourself because they're a little bit more specific to this build. There will be other bows, and there will be plenty of bows and gloves, or bows and boots that exist on trade, I think, that you may just purchase outright. But anyway, here's some of the materials they use. This was for the bow, so really just an essence, and then a lot of bench crafting and harvest crafting. This one was for the gloves. Okay, a lot of actual currencies involved here. This is for the boots, and I forgot that Maven Orb of Dominance there, and then this is for the quiver. So guys, that's it for the crafts. Okay, the cluster jewels, we give a little bit of a mention there. We give honorable mentions to some of the easier crafting, but these are the big four that are what you need to work up towards. And I will say that the bow is tied very deeply to Nimbus, whereas the boots are tied pretty deeply to this cluster craft. And the gloves are actually kind of tied to Headhunter, because once you get Headhunter, you're going to lose the resistance roll on the belt, and you can make up for it coming back in here with these gloves. You get more resistance back into the build. So things become a little more flexible with more rares as you continue on, but they're high tier rares, and they're definitely not the easiest crafts in the world. Some of them are very old. Actually, 3 of the 4 are really old common crafts, and even these gloves are fairly similar to what people have been crafting before. So those of you in the know for making bow builds, this should look like pretty familiar crafts. But I did get a lot of questions on crafting, especially the bow, both the earlier variants and the later variants. So hopefully this will help you figure out how to go about crafting. I sometimes use Craft of Exile for this, but I wanted to keep the video a little shorter and just kind of go through in-game with the different steps that would be involved. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments section down below. And if it's related to Tornado Shot and gear like that, then just look for my Tornado Shot Ultra in-game variation of the build like 9 months ago or something. In 3.25, I came out with a video on that, and you can see that performance, that path of building, and get a sense of the gear that I was using exactly for that. It definitely featured a pair of gloves and pair of boots that were just about exactly like this. Alright guys, that's it for this video. Thank you for watching. We'll see you guys next time.